Welcome to Warblog. Today we're looking at the Mbarara and Masaka offensives, Uganda, the Uganda-Tanzania war. Now, essentially, it's quite interesting. I've been interpreting this from the book that I have. Hopefully it won't be this slow throughout, but book by the War in Uganda, The Legacy of Idi Amin. It's actually one of the best books I've sort of read. I mean, I'd have to sort of qualify that by doing some thinking and stuff like that, but it sort of just, although there's a bit of rambling about the politics, pretty much goes through, you know, the sort of the actual sort of things that happened in the war, so to speak, sort of almost chronologically. I mean, it wanders off a little bit, but a lot of books, they sort of, I don't know, they seem to focus more on, you know, all the politics, and then, you know, the actual things that happen on the ground, you know, what is relevant to these games seems to be sort of just referenced in passing, whereas this seems to be the other way around. It's quite, again, it's sort of interesting because the Wikipedia doesn't have this, and now I sort of read this and I've interpreted this, and I sort of think, well, hang on, there's actually scope for more scenarios here. For example, I could do this one here as a rectangle like that. That would be the Mbarara one, and I could do this one, which is, I think, Katera. Not sure what's written under there, but it's basically an airstrip, and it's surrounded by these hills. We'll go into that in a bit. And then there's this sort of Katera under there or something near Sango Bay. But this is a sort of a scenario in its own right. So there's another one I could extract. So you would be taking, instead of these sort of 3 hexes around the objective hex, you know, you can just imagine that on a much bigger scale, offering the scope for what happened there. I'll come back to that in a bit. And then there's this other one here, which could be sort of the road to Masaka. You know, so there's 3 scenarios in it, and I might do that because it just sort of, it seems to fit the way I want to sort of approach these things, and sort of, you know, it wasn't just sort of you know, the sort of the invasion of Uganda. Now, to put it into perspective, this is what they call the second phase in the book. It calls it the second phase. I'm not sure whether I've written that down here. It's got some interesting anecdotes which I'll get onto in a bit. But basically, if you look at, I'm not going to go into it, but if you look at all the other scenarios, you see there's Lukoma, which we're not getting to yet, Mutukala, and the Kayaka scenarios. These are sort of not so much the first stages, but this Mutaka, there's this one here, the Mutukala offensive, was sort of the first phase where they cross the border and take Mutukala. I'm pretty sure that's what happens there. And they hold, basically, and there's a lot of politics. So that's Mutukala taken. So they're still on this side of the border. But essentially, and it's quite interesting, I don't want to get too much into politics, but I'll cover it briefly. The Union of African Nations, or the OW, Union of African States, or something like that, basically the African equivalent of the UN, essentially just told Tanzania to just stop, cease fire, hold everything, and Tanzania is saying, well, you're not actually, you know, acknowledging that the Ugandans have, you know, caused us a great slight, that they've invaded our lands and they destroyed these towns. They've destroyed the Kayaka Peninsula, the Kayaka, what do they call it? They call it something. I can never remember that name. I can never remember what you call it. It's a sort of a blob that picks. It's when you've got, like, if you have a line like this, that's fair enough. But if you then had a big splurge coming out there, it would be quite vulnerable, because you could take it on either side. They call it something. I'm really frustrated that I can never remember. My brain is made of pudding anyway. I can never remember anything. But they call it something. They keep referring it to the Kayaka Peninsula, not peninsula. But anyway, it doesn't matter. The African Union refuses to accept that Uganda have really done, sort of, committed these atrocities or whatever. I can't think of the right words that they use in the book, but they don't acknowledge that. They just say, look, you just have to sort of like cease fire and leave it at that. And also the Ugandans refuse to apologise for what they've done, etc., etc. And I think the UAE, the African UN, basically wants them to move out of Mutakala as well. And they refuse to do this, and so because they've been, because they're not getting the sort of response that they want through negotiations, and they fly off to a Kampala or something, and apparently they have an impasse. They can't agree on anything, and the party that go there sort of head back to the airport. They're chased back to the airport. Say, look, with our guys are now here, and the Tanzanian representatives, they say, well, we've got nowhere to stay, and so we'll put you up in a hotel because they're getting the flight back, so they're going to miss the flight if they, their return flight leaves, because the Ugandans didn't turn up for the meeting. And they said, well, but get you a hotel. And he says, well, I haven't brought my toothbrush. And the other guy says he hasn't brought his pajamas. And so they leave, and it basically states that at that point, the Tanzanians are starting to sort of, because they're frustrated with the rate of progress in the negotiations, they're starting to feel that, basically, I think that those negotiations go on after this has started, actually, when they're more towards having taken out these places and they're winning this phase of the war. They're sort of posturing, and they're sort of, instead of, they know that they're going to win, so they're sort of delaying the negotiations in the hope that the military aspect of it will speak for itself, so to speak. But essentially, the first stage is when they take Mutakala, and then this is what they then decide, because negotiations are not going properly, that they're going to take these two towns. So we've got Mbarara over here and Masaka over here, and so they're going to take these two places. And you can see there's a road up there, and then there's the road up here. Now it does leave this sort of big empty space in the middle. I don't know, there's no mention of that. There's no mention of real Ugandan force dispositions. Basically, they have the 207th Tanzanian Brigade, 201, 208, and over here the 206. I put in some independent anti-aircraft things, and we'll get onto that in a bit maybe. But this is the first sort of stage, and this is why I say this could be a game in its own right. They decide they're going to take out, I think it's Lukoma airstrip, but now it mentions that there's these units. There's like 800 Ugandans with APCs and tanks. Now they say if they attack here and head up this way, they'll be flanked. So what they've got to do is take this out first. And they sort of say, well, they could go up the road, but it would put them in line of sight of the Ugandan tanks, or they could go through all this swamp. And they trek through all this swamp, and they have a party that goes off to scout it out, and they say, well, it's just too swampy, it's just too wet. They're up to their chests in water. And the commander of the 207th says, sod that, I will do it. And he says he's not going to send his troops off on something he wouldn't go off, so he goes off with them. And they end up wading through swamps and whatnot up to their necks. And they later become known as the Amphibious Brigade, in reference to that. They don't actually become amphibious, it's sort of, because of what they did. And by the time they got there, 200 of the men were so ill of malaria and all the midges, and because of the journey that they had to be airlifted out. But then basically they got there, then they started their artillery fire on here, and when they got there, they'd all sort of gone. So they take out this first, and then once that's done, they then use the 201 and the 208 to basically attack here and outflank. Now, before they engage in that attack, and it's quite interesting really, the night before, the Tanzanian Brigade Commanders had a meeting and some drinks, during which they discussed the fact that each side was listening to each other's radio communications. The book says they then decide to play a trick. Now, that's how the book says it. I mean, whether or not it was a trick as in a joke, or whether or not they actually, decided in earnest as a strategy, or whether it's just just turned up. The exact, I don't know, the exact nuance of how that decision was made is, I don't think they decide, oh, it's a trick. It sounds as though they're going to have a good laugh. But what they did when they got back to their positions and they got on their radios, they basically said, they started communicating with each other in the knowledge that obviously the Ugandans are listening, and they said, are the Cubans ready on the right? To which response said, ready, sir. And then it said, are the Israelis ready on the left? Ready, sir. It sounds like a English Irishman Scotsman joke, doesn't it? And then the third message said, are the Americans ready in the centre? To which the response was, ready, sir. And it said within minutes the Ugandan forces began leaving the area, leaving only the units around Lukoma that couldn't get away. So that's what happened there. And again, you can't reflect that in a hex encounter game. You can't say, oh, I'll roll the player trick card or something like that. And that's one of the things, I think that whenever you've got any of these games, there's always the suspension of disbelief, or the ability to simulate, the nuances of things that are actually almost as significant as anything else, that are quite difficult to do. And that's why you need a little more open play on things. But I think that's fascinating, really. And it's also worth noting that their commanders actually reprimanded them for that. Although it was successful, they somehow reprimanded them, and I don't know why. So that's that as a sort of story. There's not a lot much more to it. I think either following that or at the same time, these units start to sort of march up towards Mbarara, and they basically, at one point, as a passing Lake Nakiali, they encounter some Ugandan armoured units, I think, or some Ugandan units, and they run off towards Gayaza, and they sort of give chase. But Gayaza is sort of there when you look at it on the map, but I think it's a bit close to Mbarara. I'm suspecting they're sort of maybe referring, because they do refer to Lake Nakiali as well, so it might be more here, but that's where Gayaza is, and so I've put it there. But they chase them and they get ambushed, and they lose like about 30 men. It's the biggest loss of the war, and it causes the whole of the Tanzanian force to sort of slow their advance down. But it mentions a lot of other places where battles happened. It's saying that Katera, Kalizo. It also mentions Bukeri there, but also Miyakiteli and Sanga. Now, these two, I don't know where they are. Now, because they were mentioned with the same other places, I put them there. I was tempted to sort of put one here and one here to sort of get that central thrust, but I don't know where they are. I can't find them. So they could be elsewhere. They might be sort of more on the, outskirts. They could be just sort of lost in translation. It might be that I just can't see where they are. But anyway, so beyond Gayaza and what I've just mentioned there isn't much more. They get up to here. They mention there's a battle sort of in quite a few places, and all of those could be scenarios in their own right as well. So this first phase, and they call it the first phase, has its own structure and process associated with it in the advance. There's a big battle, around Masaka, but essentially they defeat the Simbas here. There's the Suicide Brigade in here. All this stuff I'm not going to go too much into, but they defeat that, and I think they basically raise these two towns. This is a camp that they're told that in Kalisizo there's a camp holding Tanzanian prisoners or Tanzanian citizens. When they get there, they don't find any camps, but they find a lot of Ugandan soldiers. So they put up a resistance, rolling back, but the extent of that isn't really detailed. Getting this far into details, sort of quite good in its own right. But it sort of suggests that through and through, for example, here the Ugandans ran away. Here it says that they just ran away. The only people left were the people that couldn't run away. When they got there, they found, they basically started to use the Ugandan hardware. So they basically didn't really have a lot of hardware themselves, because the Tanzanians didn't have any arms deals. They were securing some sort of small arms deals through smaller countries, but the British wouldn't supply them with tanks, etc. And it noted that the Ugandans had a lot of equipment. They had a lot of tanks. The Wikipedia mentions that the Tanzanians at some point got rockets, but it doesn't state that in this part, so I haven't given them that. But they didn't have the arms deals. But what they say is the Ugandans were running away, leaving so much of their own hardware salient. That's it. The word I was looking for was salience. Basically, they also mentioned that when the Ugandans left the Kayaka salient, which is sort of this area here. It could have included this, but remember they couldn't get across this Kayaka River, so presumably this is the salient. When the Ugandans left, they apparently left a lot of hardware. When they were retreated from Lukoma and the hills around here, they left a lot of hardware. And they were basically, the book says that the Tanzanians, because they couldn't get anyone to supply them with hardware, that the Ugandans were actually the best what's the word, armourer they could have possibly wished for, because everywhere that they went, the Ugandans were leaving expensive hardware behind. Tanks, for example. It sort of says that they got. It doesn't say that the Tanzanians had their own tanks, but there were batteries were going on them. They couldn't get the spares for the tanks, the batteries, and they were getting the batteries out of these tanks. But it says they left eight tanks here, and they basically used those to replenish their own tanks. So it seems as though they sort of at least replaced their own hardware tank wise, and or even built up their own tank and armoured units from what the Ugandans left behind. But they're basically saying that the Ugandans were the best sort of armourer that they could have possibly wished for, and they were picking up lots of hardware from when they were running away. There's one report in the book where after one of the commanders hears the radio reports regarding the Israelis, the Cubans and the Americans being involved, he phoned up Kampala and said, this is a problem, we're running away. And the people in Kampala said, no, don't stay and fight. And he says, no, I've got an idea. You come down here and fight. I'll come up there. So I'll come up to Kampala and you come down here and fight. Yeah, so it's all quite interesting. This is the home of the Simba, which were the sort of like the elite units. Now, I haven't actually I put them there, but they've got quite big, strong units. There's two of them with 7.7s as opposed to 3.3s. So, they're not quite double. Well, they're over doubled. So, but that's where they are. Now, the big thing about this, I think, really comes down to the fact that, there was a lot of disinformation. I didn't realise what the Tanzanians had, and I think the Ugandans were overwhelmed by the number of Tanzanians and their increasing strength through hardware. But the point I'm trying to get to is what happened. I think what typifies this engagement is the fact that a lot of the Ugandans fled and ran away. And again, you can't really reflect that in the game. So when you play this, you might find out that the battle here is going to be so much easier, so much harder. You might find here that these units, now I've just put them, I haven't really given a lot of consideration so far to the sort of the balance. It could be that there's not enough here. Now, I did actually go in and just plonk a few more. I thought, I'll added all of these, I think, and I think I might have added all these first to sort of make it, to give you a sort of an ability to actually win. But it might be that you can actually put a really tough defence up there. And again, here, if this, now, I only really designed it so that this stack here, with support from this artillery later on, and possibly with these units, I think this stack and the infantry from here, and I haven't included any motorised or mechanised in that brigade because they go through the swamp and they just wade through the swamp. There's no mention of them taking hardware. But they go through, this place is referred to Bulumbi Hills, and that's the last bit of high ground, and then they get lost for a couple of days going through this swamp. Now, the thing to bear in mind, as I said, this could be a scenario in its own right, is that this is 20 miles, and so the artillery didn't really go that far. But if you look at the artillery here, I think, you know, they've got 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So really I should make the artillery smaller, but I'm not really so fussed about those sorts of levels of detail. But to some extent, you sort of might think, well, why wade through all this when we can just fire a load of artillery at them from there? You know, these are sorts of things where, you know, you can't get an exact simulation for many reasons I've said, but also those more technical reasons. The only other little thing to say is that when they took Lukoma airstrip, these hills, these are the Simba Hills, and I can't remember what these ones are, but basically they said that the Ugandans had not entrenched. They had one trench. They dug one trench. They really hadn't done anything, you know. And they said they were surprised, and they also said they were surprised to find that their artillery was on top of the hill and not behind the hills. Now, I'm not an artillery expert, but I do assume and guess that you put your artillery behind a hill to carry out indirect fire. And these two things are apparently sort of, you know, grave errors or mistakes by the Ugandans. And I just get the feeling that they weren't really up to much in regards to actually participating in a full-out war. More to the point, I think they probably, the impression I get is the Ugandans really just saw it more of a border skirmish, and they actually weren't prepared for this sort of full-on onslaught by the Tanzanians. You know, especially when you consider that all sort of like international nations were calling on the Tanzanians to basically, you know, hold a ceasefire and to come out of, you know, Mutakala in Uganda. And no one was really expecting them to sort of actually, you know, continue in earnest. And to sort of finish up on the sort of, you know, the narrative on this part, once they take out Mbarara and Masaka, they basically hold for a bit, and they say, well, that was the second phase, you know, and they hold to gauge international opinion. And what they're hoping for is that the Ugandans will apologise, they'll pay reparations for the damage they've done in the Kayaka salient, and you know, the international organisations, the UA, the African Union of whatever, will, I wonder if it's actually written down here, UOA, AOU, maybe I should make an effort to put that in there. No. Union of African Nations, I think. Anyway, they want them to recognise that Uganda has invaded their territory. Now, I think most people sort of thought it was, you know, a two-sided thing where they were both engaged in border skirmishes, and I think that's the case. But you know, it's really interesting. If you know, it's just like I always say, if Joan of Arc had just recanted prior to being set on fire, she could have saved herself. All she had to do was recant her beliefs. All the Ugandans would have to have done really is say sorry, and to have accepted, you know, that, and Idi Amin would have still been in power. And it's just little things like that. I mean, it's not quite the same as a sort of, you know, what if in the Second World War. I mean, these are just sort of quirks of fate that end up resulting in, similar to the way I just done the Afghan the Afghan revolution, the Saw revolution. You know, it just happened that that they had sort of put the wrong people in prison, but they hadn't put the people in prison that were, you know, associated with the with the actual, well, the people that rose up in the revolution. You know, if they hadn't done that, or if they had arrested those people as well, you know, these little sort of like triggers that have massive repercussions for years and years to come take place. I mean, what happened here resulted in Idi Amin being removed from power. Now, the book seems to indicate that once they took Mbarara and Masaka, up till that point, they hadn't actually intended it on anything more. But once they got to that point, they held it, and international opinion still didn't go in their way. They started to basically sort of, I can't use the word before I can remember words. They started to sort of the word. They started to basically hold back on the negotiations, so that delay the negotiations. At that, basically, what I'm trying to get to, at that point, they had determined that they were going to, whatever was going to happen, was going to result in the removal of Idi Amin from power. You know, that's sort of what they determined that they wanted to achieve at that point. Up until that point, they were really only, you know, acting in anger because their territory, the Kayakas, I can't remember what it's called now. I just said it a few times. Kayaka, whatever, had been invaded. Because of that, they didn't get the apology that they'd gone in. Now, these little quirks of fate, and you know, you sort of think, well, what happened if the Ugandans had actually used their army as it should have been used and deployed it as it should have been used? You know, all these things sort of compounded to result in, you know, a massive sort of change in power, and essentially Idi Amin being removed. So it's all quite interesting stuff, really. The only other thing I'd just say is, you know, as I read through this, you start, you know, it's a really interesting sort of war, because the Tanzanians had been trained overseas, and they seemed a lot more organised than the Ugandans. When you look at the photos, they're all sort of wearing proper military kit. As opposed to being, I get the feeling the Ugandans were more sort of more warlords, you know, the Simba and they all sort of, they were so more content with the fact that they were in power and in the army, and it was sort of a major thing, as opposed to the Tanzanians, who seemed to be sort of more of a sort of a generic army or generic armed force, but they were trained by both the Americans and the Russians and all the Chinese, I can't remember which. They basically, all their senior officers had been trained overseas in multiple locations. And when they went to train with the Americans said you shouldn't train like the Russians. When the Russians went to train with the Russians said you shouldn't train like the Americans. You know, the sort of disciplines and the doctrines that they sort of, you know, taught. They said you shouldn't mix and match these things. But the Tanzanians seem to have sort of, the book says, well, they went their own way. They made their own decisions, you know, based on their own preferences. And through and through, you get a feeling that, you know, there's this sort of war, and this, you know, that's actually quite symmetric, as opposed to some, that was potentially quite well balanced, but it has its own sort of nuances. And those nuances essentially are, the point I'm trying to get to here is that a lot of focus on modern war and modern warfare is associated with an American-Russian scenario, you know, sort of Third World War across Europe, potentially things like some sort of war engagement with China, maybe quite unlikely, you know, the potential with North Korea, etc., etc. But it seems to me, when you look at these sorts of scenarios, you got to sort of think, well, okay, if you were a first world nation, you would be looking, and you were required to engage anywhere in the world, for example, any sort of country, you would look at these sort of scenarios, not these scenarios in particular, but these periods of history and these historic accounts, and you know, you'd learn as much from these as you would from learning about the say Russian military doctrine. I'm not saying that, you know, there is something in particular to learn, but the point I'm trying to make is you would have to sort of learn a different way of war or engagement than you would against, say, another first world nation, in the sense that, you know, to anticipate the fact that a lot of these troops might run away. You know, I mean, if that trick was real, you could apply it in numerous occasions. If for some reason you could make an assumption that your enemy is more likely to run away than they are to hold, you could use that, and you would sort of look at this and you'd sort of say, okay, well, how could we, you know, how are we going to engage an enemy like that is sort of, I don't want to say unprofessional, but lacks the high professionalism of, say, a first world nation. Even against the Tanzanians, you know, a lot of these Tanzanians, they took their army from 30,000, I think, to 90,000, and they were all sort of raw conscripts. You know, I mean, if suddenly, you know, it was the other way around, and say the British, for example, had to sort of land in Sango Bay, you know, how would they? What would be the things? I mean, it would be very different going against, say, a Russian, you know, 3 Russian brigades over here, and you know, that sort of, those sorts of lessons, they're not just limited to this war, but if you look at any war, you know, like or the you know, the Sand Wars, or the India-Pakistan wars. You know, if you start to look at how these things, the wars and engagements that have no relation to, you know, Western or Eastern influence, you know, as opposed to sort of, you know, the direct influence. I'm not talking about indirect influence. For example, the Ugandans had some sort of help at a later stage from the Libyans, and you know, I think there were, in many of these instances, especially down in Angola, which was part of the, you know, the Cold War period. You've got more direct influence, but here you've got the sort of continued sort of presence of other countries that are not Western nations, that are engaged in wars, that carry out those wars in their own way. I mean, it could be that, you know, in this instance, that the Tanzanians were particularly fortunate in that their commanders made some good decisions. They were well organized, but they were going up against, you know, possibly a badly organized force, the Ugandans. But what I'm trying to get to here is that, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Tanzanians were exceptionally brilliant. They could both have been pretty lackluster and pretty poor in their general performance. But, you know, as two sort of like midway opponents, they, you know, one was particularly worse than the other, etc., etc. I don't want to say too much more about that. I'm not really even sure I want to start playing it now, because I've been talking for a while. But I was looking at this and I thought, you know, I'm particularly excited about this, because it's one of the, I don't want to say it's one of the first, because I have got others from a book, but you know, the book that I'm referring to, War in Uganda: The Legacy of Idi Amin, by Tony Avigan and Martha Honey, is pretty good. You know, it's given the perfect sort of balance of what happened, so much so that you know, it's, I feel as though I've interpreted a period of history that is not necessarily readily accessible. It's certainly not covered in that depth or that regard in Wikipedia. I'm not sure how much of that I might or might not have been able to get from online newspapers, which I sometimes try and look at. But they basically state that there was no war. There was no reporting of the war. It also added, I think it's Mbarara, because Mbarara fell first. This fell the day after. It basically, there was no reporting, and a lot of the reporters essentially refused to start going to the press meetings by the respective governments, especially in Tanzania, because they were just not being told anything, and they knew it. They were getting more of their news from the BBC, presumably the BBC radio, and from the Ugandan press, than they were sort of Tanzanians. And people were so hungry for news that when they were told that Mbarara had fallen, when it hadn't, they didn't care, even though they sort of, it was commonly known that it hadn't fallen. They didn't care because they were so hungry for any news. And then when the next day they were told that it had been recaptured, they didn't care. They were still happy for news. And then when it did get captured, it was, you know, apparently it got captured 3 times or something in the headlines, but no one really cared so much. But the point is, there wasn't any sort of reporting. So this book is actually probably, you know, quite a significant primary source for the history of this war. I mean, you know, when you compare it to sort of things like the Vietnam War, there are just so many books that every sort of battle, you know, is so heavily documented. The Second World War is, you know, there are volumes and volumes about every minute of the Second World War. You know, I've been in libraries when there's sort of like 20 books in sequence, chronologically detailing every aspect of the Second World War. You know, there's not a lot to sort of be that can be sort of potentially missed there. You know, it's all been sort of documented. I mean, you might argue over the finer details as to who did what, but most things in principle and in general have been covered in some regards. But things like this, you know, generally speaking, not. And it's that sort of level of research that I think sort of does appeal to me. And you know, I think changes this from a sort of, you know, a site that has generic examples. And I keep going on about this, and I don't want to sort of really make too much more of an issue over it. But for example, here we got the Uganda-Tanzanian war, and sort of in relation to what we've been talking about there, we might sort of say, well, you know, I mean, there's Mbarara there, and there's Masaka there. I mean, you can see quite clearly it's almost off the map. So I've sort of almost missed that. Well, I've got some of these lakes in the right place. But that's actually, to be quite honest, not that far to Kampala, but you can sort of see how that works now. But what I'm saying is something like this just doesn't cover the sort of full intricacies, because once you get beyond this border, I mean, this is not how it was in comparison to how it's been detailed here. So I'd have to sort of maybe even change this from, you know, as to sort of detail the start of the conflict with. I think that basically what this is here is I'm not sure exactly where that border is. I can't see the border, but it seems that the border might be there. This is when they've crossed the border up to the Kayaka River. And so you might sort of say, well, these units are not so far forward, because I think this starts off when they have basically moved over the border and taken the sort of the town that was up there. I really can't be bothered to sort of try and figure out what that town is at the moment. But basically, I think the border probably goes like that. I think if you look really closely, the border's there, so it goes along there like that. So there's a big straight line like that. I think you can just about see it there and there. And so they've come across the border, and that's basically the Kayaka salient in there, and that's them in Kayaka, and that's Mutakala there's Mutakala there. I think you can just about see Mutakala there. So basically what we're saying is the scenarios that we've just done are basically stemming from this bit when they've moved their units up here, and then they prepare to move across the border. They've taken Mutakala, and then they move into Lukoma, which is presumably probably in the same hex there. They take out this hex here where they've got the 800 Ugandans sort of in the swamp. So they take out that, and then they march up here to Masaka, and then obviously along here through some roads, through some hills that we haven't got detailed here. And there's Gayaza where they get the ambush, and they get to, you know, sort of they take that out. That's where the Simba base is. So essentially you can start to sort of see that, and you can start to sort of say, well, okay, well, there's no way we can sort of encompass that degree of detail. But the thing is, I think even at this scale, you can actually portray that second stage probably quite happily. And maybe, you know, I'll probably be better off actually moving, especially these Simba units, moving them up here, moving the units more over here, and taking this borderline over here off, etc., etc. Now that road I don't think goes over there at the moment, because we need to get these engineering units over to actually make the bridge, because that's the stage we're at. And then obviously there's Bukoba, which wasn't taken. But here you could sort of say, well, you know, if the Ugandans were intent on invading Tanzania, they could have gone a lot further, and it really was taking of that Kayaka salient. And basically the Ugandans were sort of trying to justify it. They were repatriating, you know, what they considered to be theirs, and you could almost sort of see that, because you know, if the river does go there, they might have seen the natural border being the river, and they've moved over to take it, etc. I'm not trying to justify what the Ugandans did, but you know, it wasn't the sort of full-scale invasion of Tanzania that I think Wikipedia and on my first readings of it all seem to suggest. It was really just this sort of marginal land, almost similar to sort of the same way that the Iraqis considered Kuwait. And I don't want to justify that either, but you know, it was sort of, you know, a relatively small parcel of land, and they just sort of, due to political sort of differences, they just felt, like invading it without a lot of opposition, a bit like the football war, really. I think it's one where they sort of, they march into this swampland and there's no opposition at all. They just get bombed with a few airplanes and then they withdraw. One of these sorts of, engagements over a bit of sort of wasteland, really, or something that's not particularly of any sort of particular economic value. I mean, this, taking that wasn't that significant. But I think at this stage I might go back and actually move these across here. But the point I'm trying to get to here is that, with something like this, it's quite hard to sort of depict, although you can, I think, to some extent. I mean, this engagement and translate it over to there. So what we've got is that section there, which, to be quite honest, is a significant chunk of the main part of this map, because all they've got to do then from Masaka is go up through here into Kampala. So it's probably not a lot more of that book to read. So anyway, as I said, I might actually so there's Lukoma, we've got that one. There's Masaka. They basically counterattack at Lukoma and push Tanzanians back to Lukoma and Masaka, and then they basically counterattack back. So it's the only time the Ugandans do anything between there and there, and that is actually covered in this scenario here, where we've got Lukoma there and Masaka there, and they pushed the Tanzanians back from there down to there with the help, in theory, of the Cubans, but it's so much so that there's hardly any Cuban units there. But that's what they say. They say just a company of tanks, company of whatever. And I think that's all the Cuban forces that are there. So it doesn't seem as though there's going to be much significant effect by their presence, but maybe I should go back and double it all. But that's that bit. So when you start to look at these maps and look at the differences in scale, that little section is there. I might go back and redo this, because one of the things that they said, they didn't want to go too far into the artillery range of the Ugandans. Well, if there's their artillery and it's a range of 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, I mean, from there they can get everything. But if I was to do it again at this sort of scale, these hills here, they would actually be, a different game. So I think I might do that. So there's 3 games I might do in here. And although I haven't really read the rest of the book, there's possibly not much more to do in regards to the whole war, and which is essentially to some extent covered by this. And there are a few others. I think the 47 Israeli war, Arab-Israeli war, I've pretty much done the whole thing on that, as with other, except one last engagement towards the north, and the grand putting it all together, like this one has put it all together. So there's 2 more in there, but once that's done, that's the whole war done. As opposed without certain little details being taken into place. But what I'm trying to get to here is, once this is done, this will be the whole Uganda-Tanzanian war, the Kayaka war, as they put it. Liberation war, as Ugandans call it now. That's the whole thing sort of together. And what I might do is actually put it together in a I wanted to do it as a sort of a Kindle book, or a book I could sell on Amazon and just start selling it on Amazon. I mean, no one really plays this game, so I don't know why that would be interesting. But once I've got to that stage, what I think I might do is basically create a complete book. That's what I intention to do. So once I get through this, and I could probably already do it, the Arab-Israeli 1947 war already, I just need a couple of scenarios, but then sort of go through it and actually write a sort of, I don't want to say an extended history, but a sort of a annotated history using the hex and counter format, detailing what happened and when in a fairly general sense, but with the potential to actually include the map and the counters as a print and play. Now, I'm not sure how that would work. Now, I can't really do it with Kindle books or sell it on Amazon in that sense, because they're books. I don't think the Kindle books are conducive to being printed out. I know that their print on demand services pretty much format you to whatever size, so you wouldn't necessarily be able to sort of print the maps out. But what I might do is actually create a little sort of things that you could buy. You could buy the book here on this site, and that's what I think I might do. It probably won't happen anytime soon, but that's my long-term goal, and then focus on each conflict, not so much one at a time, but as each conflict becomes complete and there's a full set of scenarios depicting the war from the beginning to the end, format these little sort of publications so that you can then buy them as a PDF. Basically, that's what I'm going to on this site. So you'd buy it as a PDF. Now, one of the problems I've got is once someone's bought one, they'd probably be able to sort of give it to all their friends or something. To be quite honest, I've sold PDFs, online PDF things before, or these sorts of things. Not exactly as I'm sort of intending to do, but there's less of that than you might think. You might have thought that someone would just buy it and then start sort of, selling it everywhere. But, because of the limited interest and, the fact that it probably clearly came from this site, it probably wouldn't be, that big a thing really. But I might do that so that you can then start to actually buy the complete scenarios, and it'd be just sort of something that someone could buy and they could possibly read it and point it out as reference, and maybe even print it out, and but also with the ability to possibly actually then print out everything, etc., etc. I mean, one of the reasons I think that's a good idea, and I think the format would be a bit tight in actually figuring out how to make it work convincingly, but it's basically this book that I'm referring to is exactly sort of what I'm tending to do, but in hex and counter format. That's in a very easy to follow, format that doesn't sort of warble too long, unlike these videos. But unlike a sort of like, I just bought couple of books actually. Another one, basically it's two books on the Korean War. One, the air power in the Korean War, and the other one just a sort of the long winter or cold winter. I've got another good book on the Korean War, but it focuses mainly on the Americans. But I think this one's also focused mainly on the Americans. But basically, they're endless. I mean, I know this video is going on, but this is not endless in comparison to, say, a 1,200-page book. So I'm talking about a very easy to follow thing. But just like this book, I mean, it's so easy to follow, sort of, what actually happened, going forward, phase by phase, etc., etc. So I hope you sort of think, well, that looks interesting. I did intend to sort of just jump in and play it, but I'm not going to do that now. It's 47 minutes. But it's amazing how quickly time goes when I'm sort of talking. I mean, I'm a bit tired at the moment, so I keep forgetting things like salience and whatevers. But the time still does fly, and I always marvel at the fact that if I was trying to create videos, I know there are a lot of people out there that just create videos so that they can get exposure, and I don't know what that sort of, not so much means or feels, but there is a sort of, you get a feeling that people are creating content so that they can, I think as YouTube used to say, that they can broadcast themselves. But I get the feeling that essentially what I'm saying is that content's actually, in a lot of cases, it's quite difficult to create. Like you'll get a comedian and they'll create a 20-minute sketch or some comedy feature that they will then put onto YouTube, and to create that 1 hour they have to take 50 hours. Many people, even bloggers, they will create a video, but to create a sort of 20-minute video they take like 4 or 5 hours. They go out and they create some video, they go back and edit it, and then they put in special effects and they put a beginning and an end. And what I'm saying is, content's quite hard to create, and I know that in a lot of gaming, these gaming channels, it's easy. You get these people and they fire up some game and they just sit there for an hour and 20 minutes playing the game, and there's nothing to it, And to some, I'm not saying that this is better than that, but it puts things into a sort of perspective from my perspective on sort of how some people have a bit of difficulty creating content, but not me, in a sense that I can just sit here and all of a sudden 49 minutes have gone, and I didn't really have 49 minutes. If someone said to you, hey, you've got to do this and it'll take you 49 minutes, I'd say, what? Oh man, that seems like a drain. But there, it's just gone like 5 or 10 minutes. So it's strange like that. And to put it in another perspective, I know I'm just sort of warbling and generally talking now, but I lost the ability to actually record in any sort of efficient manner. I mean, even at the moment, I'm on a new computer, and all I've done so far with this computer is use it to do these recordings. So in theory, it's better than my old one. I will be transferring it, but you know, when I lost that, it's a bit odd, really, because it's quite a pleasant thing. I'm quite not so much addicted, but I'm quite used to regularly making recordings and building up a library that, you know, although it's not particularly significant, it all adds up to the extent that, you know, it's generating traffic in YouTube. I don't get a lot. I get like 20 hits a day, but that comes from, you know, a combined base of what I've created. Now I'll look at certain things on YouTube and I can see that certain games, to be quite honest, I don't really pay a lot of attention to exactly how it works, but certain games are getting, you know, they seem to be getting sort of a fairly constant stream of traffic. But when I say constant, I mean it's all rather pathetic in the grand sense. But you know, they're getting like 3 or 4 hits every week, but it's regular. So you know, and every time you create a new video like this, you're sort of thinking, well, okay, well this might get like 1 hit every month from now on. And so you know, they create this sort of critical load of content, and then there's plus sort of, you know, the immediate sort of amount of traffic that you get in theory from people that post it as a reference and or are subscribing to the channel. In short, it's all rather pathetic and small scale. It really is. But the thing is, it's all about creating content, and for me, you know, building these games is just a pleasure, and then creating a little video again is just a little pleasure, and so it all seems so easy, you know, from that point. And as well, when I've done this video, what I tend to quite often do, and it's quite bizarre, I will actually watch it, you know, maybe twice, but I'm trying to figure out why could I possibly enjoy watching it, and I just watch it and almost just do nothing else but watch it. And there's another 52 minutes, because that's how much we've got now, done watching it. Quite often I won't watch it all, but I will. I go to bed and I'll sort of watch it, and it's quite entertaining, just almost, you know, and that's, to some extent, I get a little driver from that as to how I want to do things. But the learning point from that, which I don't really convey and which I want to do, is I should be doing things. Whenever I watch a video, I think the videos that I like watching are the ones where I'm actually moving the counters around and I can watch the counters. The ones that are not interesting are the ones where the screen, as we've done in this video for 52 minutes, 49 seconds, it's not moved. And so this is a really rubbish video to watch, but still, my motor mouth just continues to sort of, you know, with absolute ease, continue onwards, creating the minutes of content when really I should have just started and just played this. But there you go. You know, I'm just talking, and I do enjoy that, so it all adds up. But I think this is a rather aesthetically pleasing map. That's another thing that I do enjoy about all of these. You know, you sort of look at it and think, oh, you know, I like this map. You know, it works for me. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. I'll upload this, and I'll speak to you later. Cheerio.